What ancient history rabbit hole have you fully gone down? Story 1, Linear A. We can pronounce every sound and understand nothing. Linear B was cracked in 1952 by an amateur, a British architect named Michael Ventris, who decoded it over a weekend and revealed it was early Greek. The method worked because Linear B shared enough structural features with known languages that the internal logic, once the right key was found, fell into place. Linear A is the problem that Linear B's solution created. Linear A is the older script used by the Minoans on Crete from approximately 1800 to 1450 BCE. It is obviously related to Linear B. The sign inventories overlap significantly. Many symbols are clearly derived from Linear A originals. And the scripts share structural features, indicating Linear B was adapted from its predecessor. So you can take Linear A signs, apply the phonetic values established for the corresponding Linear B signs, and produce sounds. What you get is completely unintelligible, because the language Linear A encodes is not Greek. It is not Indo-European. It is not related to any language that has been identified and decoded. You can read it aloud and have no idea what you're saying. The sounds are probably approximately correct. The meaning is gone. The Minoans were the dominant maritime civilization of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. They built the palaces at Knossos that inspired the labyrinth myth. They traded across the eastern Mediterranean and influenced Egyptian, Mycenaean, and Levantine cultures. They were, by any measure, one of the major civilizations of the ancient world. And everything they wrote in Linear A, their records, their accounts, whatever their administrative and religious documents said, is silent to us. The total corpus of Linear A inscriptions is a few thousand signs on clay tablets and stone objects. Not enough to decode statistically without a known language to anchor against. The Minoans spoke in a language that died with them and left no descendants we can identify. Linear A is probably permanently undecipherable unless an ancient bilingual inscription, a Bronze Age Rosetta Stone, surfaces somewhere no one has thought to look. Story 2, the Phaistos Disc. A single object with no parallel anywhere in the ancient world. The Phaistos Disc is a fired clay disc from Crete, approximately 16 centimeters across, dating to approximately 1700 B. Both sides are stamped with 241 symbols arranged in a spiral from the outside edge toward the center, divided into groups by lines. The symbols were made by individual stamps pressed into the clay before firing, which makes the Phaistos disc the only known example of something like movable type from the ancient world, predating Gutenberg by 3.5 millennia. The problem is that nothing else like it exists. Every other ancient script has a corpus, multiple inscriptions, multiple contexts, multiple documents to compare. Without a corpus, the statistical analysis that makes decipherment possible has nothing to work on. 241 signs from a single document representing 45 distinct symbols is not enough data. Even if someone correctly proposes what the text says, there is no way to verify it against other documents. Claimed decipherments have been published periodically. Some propose the text is a prayer, some an inventory, some a navigational guide, some a liturgical hymn. None can be confirmed, and none can be refuted. The stamp-making technology alone is strange. Someone made at least 45 individual stamps specifically to create this document. The stamps represent humans, animals, heads, tools, plants, and geometric shapes. The precision of the stamping suggests a skilled craftsperson. The number of different symbols suggests a sophisticated recording system. And then, it appears to have been used once, for this single disc, and the stamps disappear from the record entirely. Whether the Phaistos disc records Linear A, some other Minoan script, or an entirely unrelated language from another civilization is unknown. Whether the spiral reads from outside to center or center to outside is unknown. The object is in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum in Crete. Researchers have been looking at it since 1908. The disc has said nothing back. Story 3, Rongorongo. The writing system that died within living memory and left almost no trace Rongorongo is the script developed by the Rapa Nui people of Easter Island and is among the most heartbreaking episodes in the history of writing systems. Because unlike the ancient undeciphered scripts whose speakers died thousands of years ago, Rongorongo's last readers died within the historical record, within living memory of people who were alive in the 20th century. The specific series of events in 1862, Peruvian slave raiders descended on Easter Island and captured approximately 1,500 people, including most of the island's political and religious leadership, the class of people who knew how to read Rongorongo. Most of those captured died of disease in Peru. The survivors who were eventually returned to Easter Island brought smallpox with them. The combination reduced the island's population catastrophically and specifically eliminated the literate class. By the time Catholic missionaries arrived and began recording the island's culture, they found a handful of elderly people who claimed to remember something about the wooden tablets covered in glyphs that had once been important. But the chain of transmission had broken. Those who remained could recite texts they'd memorized phonetically without understanding what the words meant, the way someone might recite a prayer in a language they don't speak. The actual meaning of Rongorongo is not recorded anywhere. The script reads in a practice called reverse boustrophedon. You read a line from left to right, then physically rotate the tablet 180 degrees and read the next line. The mechanical reading convention survived. The semantic content did not. Approximately 24 objects with Rongorongo inscriptions survive in museums worldwide. It may be one of the very few independently invented writing systems in human history, developed in isolation on a remote Pacific island without contact with any other literate tradition. That it was destroyed so completely and so recently is a specific kind of loss. Story 4: The Indus Script. A civilization bigger than Egypt, with writing nobody can read. The Harappan civilization, also called the Indus Valley Civilization, was, at its peak around 2500 BC, the largest of the ancient Bronze Age civilizations by geographic extent. Larger than Egypt, larger than Mesopotamia, covering approximately 1.5 million square kilometers across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, with a population that some estimates place at 10% of the world's total at the time. The Harappans built cities with something no other Bronze Age civilization had: sophisticated urban drainage systems. Their streets were laid out on grids. Their standardized brick sizes suggest centralized planning. Their weights and measures were precise and uniform across hundreds of kilometers of trade networks. They were clearly a complex, organized society with the capacity for long-distance coordination. They also produced writing. The Indus script appears on thousands of small seals, typically depicting animals, humans, or geometric designs, with brief texts of a few signs each. The total number of distinct signs is between 400 and 700, depending on how sign variants are counted, which suggests either a syllabic or logographic system. Nobody can read it. There is no bilingual text. The underlying language is unknown. There is active scholarly debate about whether the Indus script is even a full writing system encoding language, or a more limited notational system encoding names, goods, or ritual categories. This debate matters because if it's not full writing, the decipherment project is misconceived from the start. The Harappan civilization declined around 1900 BC, its cities abandoned, its population apparently dispersing. We don't know why. We can't ask them. And the specific way their world worked, how it was governed, what they believed, how their economy functioned, what language they spoke, is sealed inside a script that thousands of scholars have tried and failed to crack. Story 5: The Kukuteni Tripilia Culture, a Stone Age society that burned its own cities every 60 years between approximately 5500 and 2750 BC. A culture flourished across what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania that archaeologists call the Kukuteni Tripilia culture. At their peak, they built settlements containing thousands of structures. Some settlements covered several hundred hectares, making them larger than the early cities of Mesopotamia. By the standards of Neolithic Europe, these were enormous concentrations of people. And then, with a regularity that appears deliberate rather than accidental, every 60 to 80 years, the entire settlement would be set on fire. Not just fires that spread and got out of control, controlled, systematic burning. Starting from the outside of the settlement and moving inward, burning every structure completely. The community would then move to a new location nearby and build again from scratch. This happened repeatedly across the culture's existence, not once or twice. As a recurring practice sustained over centuries across the entire cultural area, the archaeological record shows dozens of these burned settlements, each showing the same systematic, thorough firing pattern. Why? Nobody knows. Hypotheses range from ritual purification to a response to soil depletion to a practice of building over a predecessor community's ruins. None is supported by written evidence because the Cucuteni Tripilia culture had no writing. Their own explanation for what they were doing is not accessible. The specific strangeness of this practice is hard to sit with if you try to imagine it from the inside. These were not simple people. They produced extraordinarily fine-painted pottery, copper tools, and clay figurines. They managed large communities. And approximately every 2 generations, the community gathered and burned everything they had built. The knowledge of why to do this was presumably transmitted orally and is gone. Story 6: Sangsing Dui, a Bronze Age Chinese civilization that didn't know it existed, according to history in 1986. Workers digging an irrigation channel in Sichuan province, China, accidentally broke into a pit containing one of the most extraordinary Bronze Age finds ever made. The Sangsing Dui site had been briefly noticed in 1929, but the 1986 discovery of 2 sacrifice pits and subsequent excavations continuing into the 2020s revealed the center of a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that was completely absent from any Chinese historical records. The objects from Sangsing Dui are unlike anything in the conventional Chinese Bronze Age repertoire. They include enormous bronze masks with protruding eyes on stalks, sometimes 30 centimeters long and wide, angular faces, unlike any human physiognomy. There are life-sized bronze figures, a bronze tree nearly 4 meters tall with birds perched on its branches, gold scepters, jade blades, and elephant tusks. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, and the iconography is completely distinct from the bronze work of the contemporaneous Shang and Zhou dynasties. The civilization that produced these objects existed from approximately 2800 to 1100 BCE. They had a city. They had bronze metallurgy. They had a distinctive artistic tradition of considerable sophistication, and they left no writing, appear in no other culture's records, and vanished from the archaeological record around 1100 BCE, with no clear explanation. The civilization immediately succeeding them in the Sichuan region, the Jinsha culture, shows different artistic traditions and provides no clear continuity. Sangsing Dui was not a minor site that might have been overlooked. The sacrifice pits suggest a highly organized ritual system. The bronze technology demonstrates advanced metallurgical knowledge. This was a major civilization that somehow fell entirely through the historical record and existed unknown for 3,000 years until an irrigation project found it by accident. Story 7: Great Zimbabwe, the African city that Europeans spent a century pretending wasn't built by Africans. Great Zimbabwe is a collection of stone enclosures and towers built in the Zimbabwe Plateau between approximately the 11th and 15th centuries CE, covering more than 700 hectares and representing one of the most significant architectural complexes in sub-Saharan African history. The site gave its name to the modern nation of Zimbabwe. It is genuinely impressive stonework, massive walls of granite, some reaching 11 meters in height, built without mortar using precisely fitted stone blocks. The specific historical disgrace attached to Great Zimbabwe is the sustained academic and political effort by European colonists and their sympathizers to attribute the construction to anyone other than the ancestors of the Shona people who actually built it. Phoenicians, Arabs, Queen of Sheba, pre-Islamic traders, anyone but Africans was proposed across the late 19th and early 20th centuries by writers who had decided that sub-Saharan Africans were incapable of monumental architecture. Archaeologist Gertrude Catton Thompson excavated Great Zimbabwe in 1929 and concluded definitively, based on stratigraphy and material culture, that it was built by Iron Age Bantu-speaking peoples, the ancestors of the Shona. The Rhodesian government subsequently made it illegal to publicly state that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. The political use of manufactured archaeological controversy to deny African civilizational achievement continued through the colonial period. The site itself is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its African origins are not scientifically contested. What remains interesting about Great Zimbabwe beyond its construction is what it tells us about the economy that sustained it. It was apparently the capital of a state that controlled the gold trade between the interior of southern Africa and the Swahili coast, functioning as a major node in an Indian Ocean trade network that most school curricula have barely begun to represent. Story 8, Göbekli Tepe, the temple that was intentionally buried 12,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is the oldest known monumental structure built by human hands, predating Stonehenge by around 6,000 years and the invention of pottery or agriculture. It consists of multiple rings of large T-shaped limestone pillars, some up to 5.5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, carved with reliefs of animals including foxes, boars, cranes, vultures, and serpents. The precision of the carving and the scale of the construction are extraordinary for a society of hunter-gatherers operating 12,000 years ago. The discovery and dating of Göbekli Tepe has genuinely revised the standard narrative of human civilizational development. The conventional story had been that settled agriculture led to cities, which led to temples and monumental architecture, that surplus food production enabled the specialized labor required for large-scale construction. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture. Hunter-gatherers built it. The implications for which came first, the temple or the farm, are significant and still being worked out. But the specific strangeness that doesn't get enough attention is what happened to Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BC. The people who built it intentionally buried it. They filled the structures with enormous quantities of soil, rubble, and animal bones, deliberately concealing the pillars and rings under meters of fill material. The structures were preserved specifically because of this deliberate burial. Without it, thousands of years of erosion would have destroyed the stonework. Why did they bury it? Nobody knows. The burial may have been a form of ritual decommissioning, a closing ceremony for a sacred site whose function had ended. It may have been related to the transition to agriculture in the region. It may reflect something about their cosmology that we have no access to. Whatever the reason, they preserved what we now study by hiding it, and they hid it for a reason we cannot reconstruct. Story 9, Nabta Playa, a stone circle in the Egyptian desert that's older than Stonehenge in the Egyptian Western Desert, approximately 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, sits Nabta Playa, a site of standing stones, stone circles, and structured alignments built in what is now one of the most inhospitable parts of the Sahara by cattle-herding peoples who lived there when the Saharan humid period made the region wet and hospitable, between approximately 7,000 and 5,000 BC. The site's main stone circle is approximately 4 meters in diameter and contains calendar alignments, specific standing stones that point toward the position of the summer solstice sunrise, indicating its builders had developed enough astronomical knowledge to identify and mark this specific moment in the year. The alignment predates Stonehenge by more than 1,000 years. Nabta Playa receives a small fraction of the attention that Stonehenge or other European megalithic sites receive, despite being older and representing an equally sophisticated, possibly more sophisticated, given the astronomical precision in a structurally simpler monument, understanding of celestial cycles. Part of the reason is the site's location in the Egyptian desert, which makes it difficult to visit and photograph. Part of it is probably the broader underrepresentation of African archaeological achievement in popular discourse. What Nabta Playa most powerfully illustrates is the breadth of early human intellectual and organizational capacity. The people who built it were mobile cattle herders, not settled farmers. They had no cities, no writing, no bronze. They had the observational patience and mathematical capacity to identify and mark solstice positions with standing stones, and the organizational capacity to move and erect those stones in a desert that is now completely dry and uninhabitable. The Sahara was once a grassland with lakes and cattle. The people who herded there were watching the sky carefully enough to build a calendar out of stone. Story 10: Long U Caves. Enormous underground chambers that nobody built according to any historical record. In June 1992, a farmer in Longyu County, Zhejiang Province, China, decided to drain a pond that local people had always assumed was naturally bottomless. When the water level dropped, he discovered the pond was not a pond at all, but the water-filled entrance to a vast underground chamber with walls carved in parallel chisel patterns, columns left to support the ceiling, and an interior volume that could house a large building. Subsequent draining of other ponds in the area revealed 5 more similar chambers. The Longyu Caves are a network of enormous hand-excavated underground spaces, each approximately 30 meters wide, 15 meters high, and covering anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 square meters of floor area. The walls and ceilings are covered in precise, evenly spaced parallel chisel marks applied at a consistent 60-degree angle. The engineering quality is high. The scale of the excavation project, hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of rock removed by hand in a pattern that suggests coordinated planning, is enormous. No historical record mentions them. No Chinese historical document describes their construction, their purpose, or who ordered them built. The Qin dynasty, which operated in the region and is the closest obvious candidate based on the cave's estimated age, left no record of the project. Local oral traditions had no knowledge of human construction. Communities assumed the caves were naturally occurring before the draining revealed their artificial character. Theories range from military storage to refuge from conquest, to quarrying operations that happen to produce usable chambers, to ceremonial spaces. The parallel chisel marks on every surface suggest something more deliberate than a quarry. The lack of any historical mention for an engineering project that would have required thousands of workers is genuinely baffling. The caves are there. The record of who made them is not. Story 11: Cahokia. America's largest pre-Columbian city was bigger than London and then disappeared at its peak around 1100 C. The city of Cahokia sat near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers in what is now the suburbs of St. Louis, Illinois, and supported a population variously estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people. By the standards of its era, this made it one of the largest cities in the world, comparable in size to London at the same period, and substantially larger than any other settlement north of Mexico. The city was built around Monk's Mound, the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America, a flat-top pyramid of packed earth, covering approximately 6 hectares at its base and rising approximately 30 meters. The surrounding plaza and the hundreds of smaller mounds organized around it represented a sophisticated urban planning effort, coordinating a labor force of enormous scale to reshape the landscape deliberately. Cahokia also contained one of the more haunting archaeological discoveries in North American history, a series of mass burials, including Mound 72, which contained the remains of hundreds of people sacrificed in apparent ritual contexts, including one burial of a man laid on a 20,000 beaded cape of shell, surrounded by the carefully arranged bodies of young women. The scale of organized religious power this implies is significant. By approximately 1350 C, Cahokia was effectively abandoned, before European contact, without written records or descendants who maintained continuous memory of what happened there. The explanations offered by archaeologists, environmental stress, deforestation, flooding, political fragmentation are plausible, and none is definitively established. One of the largest urban centers in medieval-era human civilization rose, flourished, and collapsed in what is now the American Midwest without most Americans knowing it existed. Story 12, the Copper Scroll, the Dead Sea Scroll that is actually a treasure map among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered between 1947 and 1956 in caves near Khirbet Qumran. Most are religious texts, manuscripts of Hebrew scripture, community rules, hymns, and other writings of the Jewish sect that apparently produced them. One scroll is different from all the others in material, in content, and in the questions it raises. The Copper Scroll is written on thin sheets of copper, not leather or papyrus. It is not a religious text. It is a list. Specifically, it is a list of 64 locations where gold, silver, temple vessels, and other valuable objects are buried. A treasure map in scroll form, specifying quantities and hiding places in the ancient Judean landscape. The total value of the treasure described, if the text is taken literally, is enormous by any ancient standard. The specific interpretive problem: the Copper Scroll's language is closer to the Hebrew that would develop into medieval and modern Hebrew than to the formal literary Hebrew of its contemporary scrolls, as if it was written by someone using a vernacular form of the language. Its description of location, in the cave that is to the north of Bozrah, 3 cubits under the stone platform, is precise enough to be a genuine guide, but refers to a landscape that no longer exists in the same form. Whether the Copper Scroll describes real treasure is the central debate. Possible interpretations include: it records the actual hiding places of the Jerusalem temple's treasury before the Roman destruction in 70 C. It records the sectarian community's own accumulated wealth. It is a ritual or literary document encoding a symbolic rather than literal message. Or it is a later addition to the scroll cache that doesn't relate to the other documents at all. No one has found any of the treasure. The locations, if they were real, have been searched. The Copper Scroll keeps its secret by using ancient place names that don't survive on any map we have. Story 13C, the Iceman, a 5,300-year-old murder case that is technically still unsolved. In September 1991, hikers in the Titstal Alps, on the border between Austria and Italy, found a human body emerging from a melting glacier. Initially assumed to be a modern accident victim, the body turned out to be a man who had died approximately 5,300 years ago. Preserved by the specific conditions of glacial ice in a state of extraordinary completeness. Tizzy, named for the Alps in which he was found, is the best preserved natural human mummy ever discovered, and the detail of forensic analysis that has been applied to him goes well beyond anything previously possible for a Copper Age individual. The forensic picture is specific and disturbing. Tizzy had an arrowhead embedded in his left shoulder, which had perforated a subclavian artery and would have caused him to bleed out within minutes. He had a deep cut in his right hand between the thumb and index finger, consistent with defensive wounds sustained while grabbing an opponent's blade. He had blood from at least 4 different people on his gear: his knife, his bow, his arrow shafts, and his coat, suggesting he had been in violent contact with multiple people before he died. He died face down in a small hollow in the rocks, having apparently collapsed from blood loss after being shot from behind. His equipment was largely intact and of high quality, suggesting he was not robbed. He had recently eaten a full meal of ibex, red deer, wheat, and various plants, and had rested sufficiently that his guts were not empty. He was not fleeing in panic. He was ambushed after a meal. The analysis of his genome and the isotopies in his teeth has established where he grew up, what he ate, what diseases he had, and what his face looked like. We know more about C than about many people who died last century. We do not know who killed him, what the conflict was about, or whether the people who did it ever faced consequences. Story 14, the Tarim Mummies, Bronze Age people with European features found deep in western China in the Tarim Basin, a vast desert in what is now China's Xinjiang region. A series of ancient cemeteries have produced one of the most unexpected archaeological finds of the 20th century. Mummies from the Bronze Age, approximately 4,000 years old, whose physical features and textiles are inconsistent with any population known to have lived in the region. The Tarim mummies have light-colored hair, tall stature, and facial features that are clearly not East Asian. They are buried with finely woven plaid textiles, high felt boots, and other material culture that resembles Bronze Age Central Asian and European assemblages more than anything from contemporaneous Chinese sites. The combination of their physical appearance and their grave goods created an immediate and politically charged debate about who these people were and where they came from. The genetic analysis published in 2021 was revelatory in a direction that nobody had clearly anticipated. The Tarim mummies are not migrants from Europe or from the Central Asian steppes. They are genetically isolated. Their DNA suggests they descend from an ancient North Eurasian population that diverged from other human groups very early and lived in the Tarim Basin in apparent isolation for thousands of years. They are neither European nor East Asian, but a distinct lineage that apparently developed its culture independently. The specific questions this raises are significant. How did a geographically isolated population in a desert basin develop sophisticated textile technology comparable to Bronze Age European standards, independently? What happened to them? Where did they go? The genetic signature of the Tarim mummies is not clearly reflected in any modern population. A distinct human lineage that lived in Central Asia for millennia apparently disappeared without clearly identifiable descendants. Story 15: The Giraffe Civilization, an entire Bronze Age culture found by accident after a flood in the spring of 2001. Floods in southeastern Iran exposed ancient graves in the Halil Rud River Valley near the town of Giraffe. Local people began looting the graves, and the objects that reached the antiquities market were extraordinary carved chlorite vessels decorated with mythological scenes, animals, and geometric patterns of a sophistication and a style that nobody had seen before. They matched nothing in the existing database of known ancient Near Eastern cultures. When archaeologists investigated and excavations began, they found evidence of a Bronze Age civilization, the Giraffe culture, that had flourished in the region from approximately 3000 to 2200 BCE, contemporaneous with the early Sumerian city-states and the Egyptian Old Kingdom. The scale of the site was enormous: settlement mounds covering hundreds of hectares, a major architectural complex with mud brick construction, and cemeteries with thousands of burials. Some researchers, most prominently Iranian archaeologist Youssef Majidzadeh, have argued that Giraffe may represent the location of Arata, the legendary city mentioned in early Sumerian texts as a distant, wealthy trading partner that Sumerian kings sought to access. Arata sent lapis lazuli, gold, and silver to Mesopotamia in exchange for grain, and its location has never been conclusively identified. The Giraffe region is in the right direction from Mesopotamia, and the material culture of the Giraffe civilization includes exactly the kinds of luxury objects that appear in Sumerian descriptions of Arata's exports. Whether Giraffe equals Arata remains unresolved. What is established is that a major Bronze Age civilization, operating at the same level of complexity as the early Mesopotamian city-states, existed in southeastern Iran and was completely unknown to modern archaeology until flood erosion and looting revealed its cemeteries in 2001. Story 16: The Elephantine Papyri. Jewish soldiers in Egypt who had their own temple and their own god. Among the most surprising documents in ancient history are those from a Jewish military garrison stationed on Elephantine Island in the Nile, near modern Aswan, in the 5th century BC. The Elephantine Papyri, private letters, contracts, and official documents written in Aramaic, provide a window into a Jewish community living in Egypt under Persian rule that is strikingly different from the religious picture that standard biblical scholarship would predict. The Elephantine garrison was apparently descended from Jewish soldiers who had served in Egypt possibly since before the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Their documents show that they had built their own temple on the island, dedicated to a deity they called Yahu or Yahweh, at a time when the temple in Jerusalem was the supposed sole legitimate site of Jewish worship. The existence of this temple is not mentioned in any biblical text. The religious practices at Elephantine are equally surprising. Documents reference multiple divine figures alongside Yahu, including a consort figure, suggesting the Elephantine Jews practiced a form of religion that retained elements of ancient Near Eastern polytheism that the Jerusalem-centered tradition had either abandoned or suppressed. Their theology appears to be a distinct regional variant that developed differently from the Judaism that would become normative. When their temple was destroyed in a conflict with the local Egyptian priests around 410 BC, the Elephantine Jews wrote letters to the authorities in Jerusalem and Samaria asking for help. Jerusalem didn't respond. Samaria did. The geopolitical and theological implications of that response, that the Jewish community at Elephantine had a closer relationship with the Samaritan community than with the Jerusalem priesthood, are significant for understanding how diverse early Judaism actually was. Story 17, Small River Cemetery No. 5. Boat coffins, giant wooden symbols, and no settlement nearby Small River Cemetery No. 5 is the designation given to a Bronze Age burial site in the Tarim Basin in what is now Xinjiang, China, part of the broader Tarim Mummy archaeological complex, but with features so distinctive that it deserves specific discussion. The site was first investigated by Swedish explorer Folke Bergman in 1934, and then largely forgotten by Western scholarship until Chinese-led excavations from 2003 brought it back into focus. The burials at Small River Cemetery No. 5 are placed in boat-shaped coffins made from animal hides, entire cowhides sewn into oval forms, buried approximately a meter underground. Above each burial, the site is marked by enormous wooden posts rising several meters above the ground, shaped like oars or like phalluses depending on the interpretation. The posts appear to mark gendered distinctions, one type over male burials, another over female. The visual effect of the site as the excavators encountered it was extraordinary. A sand dune covered in large wooden posts, some still standing after 3,000 years in the desert's preservation conditions, rising from the sand in patterns that suggested an organized system of marking the dead. What makes the site additionally strange is its isolation. No settlement has ever been found nearby. The people who buried their dead here, in a precise and deliberate system of boat coffins and marked posts in the middle of the Tarim Desert, apparently did not live within the immediate area. They came there specifically to bury their dead, and then left. The symbolism of the boat coffins, suggesting a journey, combined with the desert location far from water, gives the site a specific otherworldly quality that excavation photographs capture in a way that description doesn't fully convey. Story 18, the Amarna Letters, royal gossip from the Bronze Age, written in clay. The Amarna Letters are a collection of approximately 382 clay tablets discovered in 1887 at the site of El Amarna in Egypt, the short-lived capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten. They are diplomatic correspondence, letters between the Egyptian court and the rulers of other major Bronze Age powers, including Babylon, Mitanni, Hatti, Assyria, and various Canaanite city-states, written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East in the 14th century BC. What makes the Amarna letters exceptional is not just their historical significance, but their specific human content. This is diplomatic correspondence conducted between living people with specific concerns, frustrations, and personalities, and those qualities come through the 3,000 years of distance remarkably well. The Babylonian king writes to Akhenaten, complaining that the gifts he received were insufficient, that the gold Egypt sent was not enough for my messenger's expenses for the journey, and requests more gold with the explanation that in Babylon gold is as common as dirt. He asks repeatedly for Egyptian princesses in marriage, and Akhenaten's court repeatedly declines, prompting increasingly testy letters about the asymmetry of the gift exchange. The Canaanite vassal kings write in panic about attacks from the Apiru, a marginalized group that some scholars connect controversially, to the biblical Hebrews, begging for Egyptian military support that never seems to arrive. The king of Byblos writes 17 letters progressively more desperate for help as his city is threatened, the correspondence tracking a slow deterioration in real time. The Amarna letters are the closest thing ancient history has to unedited private correspondence from the corridors of power. The anxiety, the flattery, the political calculation, and the genuine fear in some of them are completely recognizable. Story 19, the Minoan eruption, when Thera blew up and maybe ended a civilization sometime between 1620 and 1530 BC. The dating is actively debated. The volcanic island of Thera in the Aegean Sea experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The eruption was of the caldera-forming type. The magma chamber beneath the island was sufficiently emptied by the eruption that the overlying rock collapsed into it, producing the dramatic circular bay that Santorini is known for today, and sending enormous quantities of volcanic material into the atmosphere. The scale of the eruption was genuinely extraordinary. The volcanic index for the Thera eruption places it among the largest eruptions of the past 10,000 years, comparable to Tambora in 1815. The eruption would have produced tsunamis that struck coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean, sent ashfall over a region spanning hundreds of kilometers, and injected enough sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to affect global temperatures. The Minoan civilization on Crete, the Bronze Age culture that built the palace at Knossos, declined sharply around the time of the eruption. Whether the Thera eruption caused the Minoan collapse is one of the most debated questions in Bronze Age archaeology, complicated by the dating uncertainty. If the eruption occurred in 1620 BC and the Minoan decline happened closer to 1450 BC, the eruption alone doesn't explain the collapse. If the eruption occurred closer to the 1450 BC date that some ice core evidence suggests, the connection is tighter. Some scholars have also connected the Thera eruption to the biblical plagues of Exodus, the darkening sky, the hail of fire, the disruption of agriculture matching effects of a major volcanic event, though this identification is far from established and the timing is debated. The caldera is there. The eruption happened. The specific consequences for surrounding civilizations are still being argued about. Story 20, the Voynich manuscript's medieval context. 600 years of the world's most studied unreadable book, the Voynich manuscript, is a handwritten illustrated book, carbon dated to the early 15th century, containing approximately 240 pages of text in an unknown script illustrating plants that don't correspond to any identified species, astronomical diagrams of uncertain purpose, human figures in blue pools connected by tubes, and section after section of content that has resisted 6 centuries of serious scholarly and cryptographic attention. The manuscript's statistical properties are genuinely strange. The text follows patterns consistent with a natural language, word-length distributions follow Zipf's law, there are internal regularities that suggest grammar. But applying the standard cryptanalytic tools that crack substitution ciphers of the medieval period produces nothing intelligible. If it is a cipher, it is a more sophisticated cipher than anything else known from the 15th century. If it is a natural language, it is one unrelated to anything in the existing linguistic record. If it is a constructed language, a medieval invented language, it is one whose inventor left no other traces. The rabbit hole quality of the Voynich manuscript is specific. Academic cryptographers, linguists, computer scientists, botanists, astronomers, and historians of science have all applied their tools to it. Every few years, a new proposed decipherment emerges with enough apparent coherence to generate media coverage, and everyone has subsequently failed to withstand scrutiny against the full text. The manuscript absorbs proposed solutions and continues to say nothing. The plant illustrations are particularly disturbing because they are clearly drawn by someone who thought they were depicting real plants. The level of attention in the illustration style is that of a serious botanical work, but no one has matched them to identified species. They are either fantastical or drawn from specimens no longer accessible, or rendered with enough stylistic distortion to make identification impossible. The Voynich manuscript is in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale. It has been studied more intensively than almost any other document in history. It has told us nothing. Story 21: The Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders who ended the Bronze Age and nobody knows where they came from, around 1200 B. The Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Within a century, most of the major palace states of the region had been destroyed or abandoned. The Hittite Empire fell. The Mycenaean Greek palace culture ended. Ugarit, the great trading city of the Syrian coast, was burned and never rebuilt. Egypt was attacked and barely survived. The complex web of trade and diplomatic relationships that had sustained the Bronze Age interconnected world for centuries disintegrated. The Egyptian records attributed much of this destruction to groups they called the Sea Peoples, invaders arriving by ship from places that the texts describe with names that don't clearly map to any known region. The Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelish, the Denyen. These names appear in Egyptian sources, sometimes with geographical hints that scholars have spent decades arguing about. The most widely accepted identification is that the Peliset became the Philistines of Canaan. The origins of the others are deeply contested. The cause of the Bronze Age collapse is one of the great open questions of ancient history. The Sea Peoples are a component. The Egyptian records make clear they were real and caused real damage, but they are probably not sufficient as the sole explanation. Climate proxy data indicates a severe drought affected the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Systems collapse theory suggests the interconnected trade network may have been fragile in ways that made regional failures cascade. Earthquakes have been proposed. Internal revolts. Some combination of all of these, who the Sea Peoples were, where they came from, and whether they were cause or symptom of the collapse, whether they were the destroyers or refugees themselves displaced by the collapse, is genuinely unresolved. They arrived out of somewhere, ended the Bronze Age, and the record of who they were before they appear in Egyptian inscriptions is simply gone. Story 22. The Oracle at Delphi. The Pythia was probably high, and the prophecies were real political intelligence for approximately 1,000 years. The Oracle at Delphi was the most important religious and political institution in the ancient Greek world. Kings, generals, and city-states consulted the Pythia, the priestess who sat above a sacred chasm in the innermost chamber of the Temple of Apollo, before making major decisions. The consultations were not cheap or easy. Suppliants paid substantial fees, traveled significant distances, and waited. And then the Pythia spoke, and what she said was treated as the word of Apollo. The geological investigation that began in the late 1990s and published findings in 2001 found that the temple at Delphi sits above a geological fault, and that two faults intersect directly beneath the temple. These faults allow the migration of hydrocarbon gases, including ethylene, through fissures in the rock. Ethylene gas, inhaled in sufficient quantities, produces euphoria and disorientation consistent with the ancient descriptions of the Pythia's altered state during consultations. The Pythia may literally have been inhaling naturally occurring psychoactive gases from a crack in the earth. The ancient reports of her behavior, the disorientation, the odd speech patterns, the apparent trance, are consistent with ethylene exposure. Ancient sources described vapors rising from a chasm beneath her tripod. The geology is actually there, but the oracle's accuracy, and the oracle was genuinely accurate in ways that impressed even skeptical ancient commentators, probably also reflects something else. Delphi was the information hub of the ancient Greek world. Every city-state, every king, every general who consulted it brought information about their own situation, their plans, their fears. The priests who collected that information, observed the patterns, and composed the responses had access to political intelligence that no individual power had. The prophecies that were accurate were often accurate because the oracle knew more than anyone else about what was actually happening. Story 23: Tartaria Tablets, Old European writing, or the world's oldest script, depending on who you ask. In 1961, archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa excavated a small pit in Tartaria, Romania, and found 3 small clay tablets, a clay figurine, and approximately 26 alabaster and spondylus shell objects. The tablets were inscribed with symbols. The date of the deposit was established at approximately 5300 BC, making the tablets roughly contemporaneous with or slightly older than the earliest Sumerian writing, and significantly older than the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the other known early writing systems. The implications: if the symbols on the Tartaria tablets represent writing are genuinely revolutionary, writing would have developed in the Balkans independently of, or even before, the conventionally recognized origins in Mesopotamia. The hypothesis that the symbols represent a form of the Old European script, a broader category of symbol systems found across Neolithic southeastern Europe, has been advanced by some scholars. Most prominently, Marija Gimbutas, who argued for a sophisticated pre-Indo-European civilization in Old Europe. The mainstream scholarly consensus has been more cautious. The alternative argument is that the tablet symbols are not writing, but notation, recording specific items, quantities, or categories without encoding language, and that calling this writing in the same sense as the Sumerian cuneiform that followed it is a category error. The distinction between proto-writing and full writing is significant and contested. The specific additional wrinkle: the tablets were found in a pit deposit with objects from different periods, and the dating is based on the associated materials rather than the tablets themselves, raising questions about whether the deposit is genuinely contemporaneous or mixed. The dating and interpretation of the Tartaria tablets remain contested, but the contest itself is interesting. The possibility that writing developed in Europe before or alongside Mesopotamia is not definitively ruled out. Story 24: Poverty Point, a Louisiana earthwork complex built by people who left almost no other trace. Poverty Point, in northeastern Louisiana, is a massive earthwork complex built between approximately 1700 and 1100 BC, contemporaneous with the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the height of the Shang dynasty in China, and the early Bronze Age of the Mediterranean. At its center are 6 concentric semicircular ridges, each up to 2 meters high, arranged in an arc approximately 1.2 kilometers across around a central plaza. A massive bird-shaped mound, the largest man-made structure in North America at its time, rises 21 meters above the surrounding landscape. The people who built Poverty Point were not farmers. The archaeological evidence indicates they were hunter-gatherers who subsisted primarily on fish and game from the local waterways. This makes Poverty Point one of the largest monumental earthwork complexes ever built by a non-agricultural society. A large-scale construction project requiring substantial coordinated labor undertaken by mobile hunter-gatherers who apparently gathered at the site rather than living there year-round. The trade networks that supplied Poverty Point are extraordinary. Objects found at the site include materials from sources hundreds to over 1,000 miles away: copper from the Great Lakes, galena from Missouri, soapstone from the Appalachians, chert from multiple sources across the eastern woodlands. The site was apparently a major hub of long-distance trade, drawing materials and presumably people from across what is now the eastern United States. What happened to Poverty Point? Around 1100 BC, the site was abandoned and the culture that produced it apparently dispersed. The descendants of the Poverty Point people, their cultural successors, are not clearly identified in the subsequent archaeological record of the region. A major trading and ceremonial center, representing an extraordinary organizational achievement, was abandoned and left to become a grass-covered set of ridges in a Louisiana field. The reasons are unknown. Story 25: Alexander's Lost Tomb, the most famous body in ancient history that nobody has found. Alexander the Great died in Babylon on June 11, 323 BCE. His body was embalmed. The Macedonian embalmers apparently found him still showing no signs of decomposition 6 days after death, which they attributed to divine preservation, and which modern pathologists have suggested might indicate the ascending paralysis of Guillain-Barré syndrome rather than death at the expected time. His body then became one of the most fought-over objects in the wars that divided his empire among his generals. The initial plan was to bring him to Macedon for burial. His body was intercepted in Syria by Ptolemy, one of his generals who was claiming Egypt, and taken to Memphis and then to Alexandria. For centuries, the Soma, the mausoleum of Alexander in Alexandria, was one of the most famous buildings in the Mediterranean world. Roman emperors visited it. Augustus accidentally knocked Alexander's nose off when he leaned in to kiss the face of the mummified body. Julius Caesar was said to have wept at the tomb, ashamed of his own small achievements. At some point between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE, the tomb disappeared from the historical record. The last secure reference to it appears to be around 390 CE. Whether it was destroyed, hidden, reused as something else, or is simply waiting to be rediscovered beneath modern Alexandria is unknown. Alexandria has been continuously occupied since Alexander founded it, making archaeological excavation extremely difficult. Every possible excavation site is under a modern building or a street. Periodic claims of having found the tomb's surface, and have all, without exception, proven to be something else. The body of the man who conquered from Greece to India, and whose tomb was one of the most visited monuments of antiquity, is somewhere in Egypt, and we cannot find it. Story 26, the Minoan snake goddess figurines. What they actually were is completely unknown. Among the most iconic objects from Minoan Crete are the so-called snake goddess figurines, faience figures of women holding snakes in outstretched arms, wearing tiered skirts and tight bodices, typically with a small figure on the head. The most famous examples came from the temple repositories at Knossos, excavated by Arthur Evans in 1903. The snake goddess identification is Arthur Evans' interpretation, applied because he found the snake holding female figure resonant with goddesses from other ancient Mediterranean traditions. The problem is that nobody knows what these figures actually were. The Minoans left no readable texts that could identify the figures. The iconographic context, they were found with other ritual objects in a storage repository, suggests ceremonial importance. But ceremonial importance covers an enormous range of possible functions. The figures could be representations of a goddess. They could be representations of a priestess. They could be votive offerings, representations of worshippers, rather than representations of the deity they were offering to. They could represent a specific ritual role, rather than a religious figure. They could be something specific to Minoan religion that has no counterpart in adjacent cultures, and for which we have no reference point. The additional complication is that Evans, who excavated Knossos and largely defined what most people know about Minoan civilization, has been substantially criticized by subsequent scholars for his restoration work at Knossos and for his interpretive framework. Some of the snake goddess figures were restored by Evans's team from fragments, and the degree to which the reconstruction reflects the original is contested. The Minoan civilization had a rich religious life. What specifically that religious life involved, and who or what the figures represent, is genuinely unknown. Story 27, the Baghdad Battery, an ancient galvanic cell or just an unusual storage container. In 1936, workers excavating near Kujut Rabu, southeast of Baghdad, found a small ceramic pot approximately 14 centimeters tall, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, with traces of an acidic substance, likely vinegar or wine, that had originally filled the vessel. The combination of these elements forms a simple galvanic cell. A battery, if the acid is present, the different metals would produce a small voltage difference in an acidic electrolyte. The objects were approximately 2,000 years old, dating to the Parthian period in the region, and were described as the Baghdad Battery by Wilhelm Gnig, the German archaeologist who first proposed the battery interpretation in 1938. The theory attracted enormous popular attention and has sustained itself in popular discourse for decades as evidence of ancient technological knowledge. The mainstream archaeological assessment is considerably less dramatic. The copper cylinder in these vessels is consistent with storage of papyrus scrolls, rolled documents, rather than an electrolytic function. Similar vessels have been found in the region without the iron rod, suggesting they may be a type of storage container and that the rod's presence is coincidental. No ancient text describes the use of such devices for electrical purposes. No other ancient technology is consistent with there being a practical use for small batteries in the ancient world. You need something to power, and the ancient world has no electrical devices to power. Whether the Baghdad batteries are accidental batteries that nobody in antiquity understood to be batteries, deliberate batteries used for some purpose that left no textual record, or simply unusual storage containers that happen to function as batteries, is genuinely unresolved. The function as battery is confirmed. The purpose, if any, is not. Story 28: The Saqqara Bird, an ancient Egyptian wooden object that might be a model aircraft or definitely isn't in 1898. Archaeologists excavating a tomb at Saqqara, Egypt, found among the artifacts a small carved wooden object resembling a bird, which was catalogued and stored at the Cairo Museum of Antiquities. It sat in storage for over half a century before Egyptian physician and amateur archaeologist Khalil Masiha re-examined it in 1969 and proposed that it was not a bird model, but a model of a glider, an ancient Egyptian aircraft. The specific features that Masiha pointed to: the wing cross-section has a dihedral angle and a cross-sectional profile that he described as consistent with airfoil geometry. The tail structure is vertical rather than horizontal, like an aircraft fin rather than a bird tail feather. He performed tests suggesting that a scaled-up version could achieve flight. The mainstream Egyptological assessment has not accepted the aircraft interpretation. The object is most naturally interpreted as a bird. The ancient Egyptians made many wooden bird models used in religious contexts as offerings or representations. The airfoil wing section is consistent with how a carver would naturally render a bird's wing in wood. The vertical tail is consistent with stylization rather than aerodynamic design. And there is no other evidence, no textual reference, no other material culture, no image in Egyptian art of any knowledge of heavier than air flight in ancient Egypt. The Saqqara bird is a well-crafted wooden bird model that happens to have geometric features that can be interpreted as aerodynamically consistent if you choose to do so. Whether that interpretation reflects ancient knowledge or a coincidence of form is the question that the fringe and mainstream interpretations disagree on. Story 29: The Antikythera mechanism, the technology that had no business existing in 100 BC in 1900 and 1901. Sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera discovered the wreck of a Roman-era ship that had sunk approximately 2,000 years earlier. Among the recovered cargo was a corroded bronze mass that was initially overlooked. When the corrosion was partially removed, researchers found the remains of an astronomical calculator, a geared mechanism of extraordinary sophistication. The Antikythera mechanism, as it became known, was studied intermittently for decades and in earnest from the 1970s onward, using increasingly sophisticated imaging technology. The most comprehensive analysis, using three-dimensional X-ray tomography in the 2000s, established that the device contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, some with teeth only 1.5 millimeters wide, precisely cut and assembled to calculate the positions of the sun and moon, predict solar and lunar eclipses, and track the 4-year cycle of the ancient Greek Olympic Games. The Antikythera mechanism predates the next most sophisticated known mechanical computing device by approximately 1,000 years. The gear-cutting precision required to make it was not known to have existed in the ancient world. The astronomical calculations it embeds, including a 19-year metonic cycle gear, a 76-year Callipic cycle, and an 18-year Saros cycle for eclipse prediction, reflect a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics that was apparently not transmitted to the mechanical traditions that followed. The specific historical mystery is not just that it existed, but that nothing like it appears in the archaeological or textual record for the millennium that follows. A technology existed, was apparently sophisticated enough to require significant design and manufacturing knowledge, and then that knowledge disappeared so completely that European clockmakers essentially had to reinvent it 13 centuries later. Story 30: The Library of Ashurbanipal, the world's first systematic library, and what it said about itself. Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, from approximately 668 to 627 BCE, was one of the ancient world's most literate rulers and the creator of the world's first systematically assembled library. Housed at Nineveh, the library contained approximately 30,000 clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform, covering subjects including astronomy, mathematics, medicine, divination, mythology, history, and literature. Ashurbanipal sent agents across his empire and beyond to collect, copy, and bring back tablets, and the library's colophons, the notes scribes added at the end of tablets, reveal explicit awareness that this collection was being assembled for posterity. Among the texts Ashurbanipal's scribes copied and preserved were tablets that were already ancient in his time, Sumerian texts that dated back 1,000 years before his reign. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in the form we know it today, was assembled and standardized by a scribe named Sinleki-Unnini, and the most complete version comes from Ashurbanipal's library. Without his systematic collection effort, much of what we know about Mesopotamian mythology and literature would be lost. The library was destroyed when Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes in 612 BC. The buildings burned, and the clay tablets, paradoxically, were fired harder by the burning buildings, preserving them more effectively than if they had remained in an archive. The fire that destroyed the library also saved its contents. When British archaeologists excavated Nineveh in the 19th century, they found thousands of tablets in the rubble of the library rooms, their surfaces still readable after 2,500 years under the ash. The colophon on many of the tablets specifies that the tablet was copied at Ashurbanipal's order and placed in his palace for anyone to read. A statement of archival purpose that is recognizably modern in its aspiration. Story 31: Tartessos, the legendary kingdom that may be under a Spanish swamp. Tartessos is a Bronze and Iron Age kingdom or civilization in the Iberian Peninsula mentioned in ancient Greek and Phoenician texts as a wealthy trading partner, known for its metal resources and particularly for tin, the metal that, combined with copper, makes bronze. Greek writers describe Tartessos as a flourishing culture with which they traded for metals. The city of Tartessos, or Tartessus, is mentioned as a specific place, and then the textual record stops. Sometime around the 5th century BC, Tartessos disappears from ancient accounts. No Greek writer after approximately 500 BC mentions it as a living culture or a trading partner. The city of Tartessos itself was never identified archaeologically with certainty. The search for Tartessos has been one of the more sustained archaeological investigations of the Iberian Peninsula. The most prominent current hypothesis places the city of Tartessos in the Doana National Park in southwestern Spain, a vast wetland that was, in antiquity, a coastal lagoon at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified anomalies in the wetland that some researchers interpret as consistent with the remains of a large ancient settlement under the mud. The specific connection to the Atlantis legend has been proposed by some scholars. Plato's description of Atlantis in the Timaeus and Critias, a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules that sank beneath the sea, could be a mythologist memory of Tartessos, which was indeed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and which did disappear from the ancient record, possibly because catastrophic flooding of the coastal lagoon system destroyed the city. Whether Tartessos is under the Doana marshes, and whether Plato was drawing on real historical memory, are questions that the ongoing archaeological surveys might eventually answer. Story 32: The Etruscans, the civilization that made Rome possible and spoke a language nobody else spoke. The Etruscans dominated central Italy from approximately the 8th to the 3rd centuries BC, and their influence on early Rome was profound and documented. The Roman alphabet derives from the Etruscan alphabet. Roman gladiatorial games appear to have Etruscan origins. The Roman toga has Etruscan antecedents, and the Roman institution of the triumph, the ceremonial procession of a victorious general, developed from Etruscan practices. The early kings of Rome may have been Etruscan. Rome was, in significant ways, built on Etruscan cultural foundations. The Etruscans left extensive archaeological remains, elaborate tomb paintings, bronze sculptures, ceramic work, and inscriptions. Their script is based on a Western Greek alphabet and is fully readable. The sounds are known. The problem is that the language those sounds encode is not related to any known language family. It is not Indo-European, not Semitic, not related to any ancient Near Eastern language that has been identified. It exists as an isolate, apparently the remnant of a pre-Indo-European language of ancient Italy that was displaced everywhere except among the Etruscans. The vocabulary is partially understood from context and from a few bilingual inscriptions. Most importantly, the Pyrgi tablets, 3 gold tablets inscribed in Etruscan and Phoenician, found at a coastal sanctuary north of Rome in 1964. The tablets give enough parallel text to confirm some vocabulary, but not enough to unlock the language. When Rome conquered Etruria in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Etruscan gradually ceased to be spoken and written. The last Etruscan inscription dates to approximately the 1st century CE. Whatever the Etruscans wrote in their own language, their histories, their religious texts, their private records, is accessible to us only in the fragments that survive, and only to the extent that context and the Pyrgi tablets allow. Story 33: Lake Titicaca's underwater ruins. The temple complex on the floor of the world's highest lake, Lake Titicaca, sits at approximately 3,800 meters above sea level on the border between Peru and Bolivia, and is one of the highest navigable lakes in the world. In 2000, an expedition from the Italian-Bolivian scientific team, led by Lorenzo Epis, discovered extensive ruins on the lake floor near the town of Copacabana. The remains of an ancient ceremonial complex that researchers estimated was over 1,000 years old, predating the Inca civilization that later dominated the region. The underwater site includes a terraced structure approximately 55 meters by 30 meters, a road or path-like feature extending approximately 800 meters, and remains of what appears to have been a wall. The structures are consistent with Tiwanaku-era construction, the Tiwanaku culture that dominated the Lake Titicaca Basin from approximately 500 to 1000 CE, and that developed a sophisticated hydraulic agriculture and monumental architecture tradition centered on the lake. Lake Titicaca has extensive significance in Andean cosmology. Both the Tiwanaku and the later Inca regarded the lake as the origin place of the sun and of humanity, and the island of the sun in Titicaca was one of the most sacred sites in the Inca Empire. The discovery of Tiwanaku-era ceremonial structures on the lake floor adds a specific archaeological dimension to a lake that was already one of the most symbolically important bodies of water in pre-Columbian South America. The investigation of the site is ongoing and has been hampered by the depth of the water, the altitude, and the logistical challenges of underwater archaeology at elevation. The full extent of the underwater complex is not yet mapped. Story 34: The Mystery of the Minoans' End, Mycenaeans, Volcano, Internal Collapse, or all three? The Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete flourished for approximately 1,000 years, building the palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, developing a sophisticated maritime trading network, producing one of the most sophisticated artistic traditions of the ancient world, and, based on the absence of obvious fortifications at most sites, apparently doing it all in an environment of unusual internal peace and security. Around 1450 BC, virtually every Minoan palace except Knossos was destroyed. At Knossos, the Linear A script was replaced by Linear B, Mycenaean Greek, indicating that the palace was now administered by Greek-speaking people from the mainland. By approximately 1350 BC, Knossos itself was destroyed. The Minoan civilization as an independent cultural entity was over. The cause or causes of the palace destructions around 1450 BC are contested, and the debate is substantial. The Thera eruption, which preceded the destructions by somewhere between 70 and 150 years depending on the dating used, is one candidate, with the argument that the long-term economic and environmental consequences of the eruption weakened the palace system enough that it was vulnerable to the next stress. Mycenaean invasion from the mainland is another candidate, supported by the evidence of Mycenaean occupation at Knossos afterward. Internal revolt or interstate Cretan conflict is a third option. Natural disasters, earthquakes are documented in the region during this period, are a fourth. Most scholars now think some combination of factors is responsible, but the relative weighting, whether the Thera eruption primarily caused it, whether the Mycenaeans conquered or simply moved into a vacuum, is not settled. The Minoans left an artistic tradition of considerable beauty and an undeciphered script. Whatever they said about why they fell, in the language we cannot read, is not available to us. Story 35, the question history keeps asking. What were they trying to tell us that we can't hear? We've been through 34 rabbit holes, undeciphered scripts and vanished civilizations and intentionally buried, temples and murder mysteries preserved in glaciers and treasure maps, written on copper and astronomical calculators that shouldn't exist, and cities bigger than medieval London that nobody remembers, and a library burned in a way that saved it. The rabbit holes are different from each other in their content, but they share a specific quality. Each one involves a moment where the record stops and the silence begins. The Minoans wrote in a script we can't read. The Sangsing-Dui civilization buried extraordinary bronze masks and left no explanation. The Kukateni Trapilia people burned their cities, and we don't know why. The Sea peoples destroyed the Bronze Age and disappeared back into wherever they came from. Z looked up at an alpine sky and saw someone raise a bow, and whatever he thought in that last moment is not recorded anywhere. The specific thing that ancient history rabbit holes do to you, if you really go down them, is make you aware of how much of the human past is simply gone. Not gone as in we haven't found it yet, but gone as in the information no longer exists anywhere and is not recoverable. The people who burned their cities knew why. The people who stamped a clay disc knew what it said. The people who built boat-shaped coffins in the desert knew what journey they were preparing for. The past was full of people with complete inner lives, complete explanations for their actions, complete cosmologies and histories and reasons. Almost all of it was oral, and it died with the people who knew it. The portion that was written down is mostly in scripts we can't read. The portion we can read is a tiny, distorted sample of what people actually thought and did and said. Ancient history is the study of what survives from the vast majority that didn't. The rabbit holes are where you notice the shape of the silence.